There is a particular silence that happens right before you say the thing you actually mean. You know the one. You are about to tell someone you love them first. You are about to raise your hand in a meeting and say you do not understand. You are about to send the manuscript, make the call, ask for help, admit you were wrong, walk into a room where you do not know anyone. And in that half second before you speak, your whole body seems to run a calculation. What if they laugh? What if they say no? What if they see me clearly and decide I am not enough? Most of us, most of the time, resolve that calculation the same way. We swallow it. We say something safer. We make a joke. We stay quiet and tell ourselves we were being strategic or professional or realistic. And nothing bad happens, which is exactly the problem, because nothing much happens at all. Brené Brown's book Daring Greatly, published in 2012, is about that half second. It argues something that sounds almost naive when you first hear it, and then becomes very hard to shake once you sit with it, that the exposure we spend our lives avoiding is not the obstacle to a meaningful life. It is the price of admission. The feeling we have learned to read as weakness, the shakiness, the dry mouth, the sense of standing there unarmored, is not evidence that something is going wrong. It is evidence that something real is happening. Brown calls that feeling vulnerability, and her central claim is that our relationship with it quietly determines almost everything else: how we love, how we parent, how we lead, whether we create anything worth making, and whether we ever feel like we belong anywhere. This is not a book about becoming fearless. It is a book about what it costs to keep armoring up, and what becomes possible when you set the armor down, not everywhere, not with everyone, but in the places that matter most. Let me tell you where the book came from, what it actually argues, and where I think it is genuinely useful versus where it asks more of you than it admits. Brené Brown is a research professor at the University of Houston, and it matters that the word researcher comes before anything else in her description of herself. She did not arrive at this material through personal revelation or a spiritual practice. She arrived through data, years of qualitative research, thousands of interviews, coded and recoded using grounded theory, a method in which you are not supposed to start with a hypothesis you love. You are supposed to let the pattern rise out of what people actually tell you, even when the pattern is not the one you wanted. Her original subject was connection. What she found underneath connection was shame, which is the thing that unravels it. So she spent years studying shame, a topic she has described, with some feeling, as the swampland of the soul. And underneath shame she found vulnerability, and vulnerability turned out to be the hinge. It is the thing shame attacks, and it is also the only door through which connection arrives. Most people first encountered her not through a book but through a talk. In 2010, she gave a TEDx talk in Houston about the power of vulnerability, expecting a modest local audience. It became one of the most watched talks in TED's history, which is its own small irony, since the talk is largely about her breakdown, her word, upon discovering that her research had implications for her own life that she did not want. She had spent years measuring and controlling a phenomenon that turned out to require her to stop measuring and controlling. Daring Greatly arrived 2 years after that talk, in 2012, and it became a New York Times bestseller. Kirkus called it a straightforward approach to revamping one's life from an expert on vulnerability. Publishers Weekly zeroed in on what may be the book's single most useful contribution, the distinction between guilt and shame, which we will get to, because that distinction is not a semantic nicety. It changes what you do on a Tuesday afternoon after you have snapped at someone. The title comes from Theodore Roosevelt. In 1910, at the Sorbonne in Paris, Roosevelt gave a speech called Citizenship in a Republic, which contains the passage everyone knows as the man in the arena. The gist is that credit does not belong to the critic who points out where the strong stumble, but to the person actually in the arena, face marred with dust and sweat and blood, the one who, at best, knows the triumph of high achievement, and at worst, if they fail, at least fails while daring greatly. Brown takes that last phrase as her thesis. To dare greatly is to show up and let yourself be seen when you cannot control the outcome. And in the introduction, she lays out the 4 questions the book will chase. What drives our fear of being vulnerable? How are we protecting ourselves from it? What are we paying when we shut down and disengage? And how do we engage with vulnerability instead so that we can change the way we live, love, lead, and parent? That is the shape of the book. Diagnosis, then mechanism, then cost, then practice. Brown defines vulnerability with unusual precision, and the precision is doing real work. Vulnerability is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Notice what that definition does not say. It does not say vulnerability is sadness. It does not say it is fragility or oversharing or a personality trait that some people have and others do not. Uncertainty, risk, exposure. By that definition, vulnerability is not something that happens to weak people. It is the precise emotional signature of any moment in which you have something at stake and no guarantee. Which means starting a company is vulnerability. So is a first date. So is a difficult diagnosis, a performance review, an apology, a creative project you actually care about, saying no to someone you want to please, and asking a question in front of people who might already know the answer. Brown reports a striking asymmetry in her interviews. When people describe vulnerability in someone else, they reach for words like courage, honesty, strength. The friend who admitted the marriage was failing. The colleague who said, out loud, that they were in over their head. When people describe vulnerability in themselves, they reach for words like weakness, exposure, humiliation, and the fear of being found out. That asymmetry is the whole trap in miniature. We admire in others exactly what we punish in ourselves. And so we develop a strange double standard where we want the people around us to be real with us, while presenting a version of ourselves that has been carefully sanded down. Brown's counterclaim is blunt. Vulnerability is the most accurate measure of courage we have. Not the absence of fear, and not the confidence that it will work out. Courage, in this framing, is entirely made of moments where the outcome is not yours to control and you go anyway. She spends time dismantling the myths people use to opt out. The first myth is that vulnerability equals weakness, which we have just addressed. The second is the claim, made often and usually with some pride, that I simply do not do vulnerability. Her answer is that you do not get to choose. You can choose whether to engage with it consciously, but the uncertainty is coming regardless. Opting out just means meeting it unprepared and alone. The third myth is the opposite failure, and it is the one I think modern culture gets most wrong. Vulnerability is not letting it all hang out. It is not confessional broadcasting, not trauma as content, not radical transparency with strangers. Brown is emphatic here. Vulnerability without boundaries is not vulnerability. It is something else, often something that uses the language of openness to get a need met, attention, sympathy, control. Which leads to the fourth myth, that we can do this alone. We cannot. And the practical form of that dependence is trust, which Brown handles with a small, memorable image drawn from her daughter's grade school classroom, where the teacher dropped a marble into a jar each time the class behaved well. Trust, she suggests, works the same way. It is not granted in one dramatic act of disclosure. It accrues in marbles, small moments of someone remembering, showing up, keeping a confidence, taking your side when you are not in the room. You share your hardest stories with people who have earned the right to hear them. Everyone does not get to hear everything. That is not armor. That is judgment. Before the book gets to what we do about vulnerability, it asks why we are all so raw in the first place. Brown's answer is that we are living inside a scarcity culture, and she credits the framing to Lynn Twist's work on money and the idea of enoughness. Scarcity is the low hum of never enough. Never enough sleep, never enough time, never enough money, never fit enough, never successful enough, never certain enough, never safe enough. Brown notes that for many people, the very first thought of the day is a deficit, that they did not get enough rest, and the last thought of the day is a different deficit, that they did not get enough done. What is useful here is that she does not treat this as individual neurosis. She treats it as an environmental condition with identifiable ingredients. Scarcity thrives wherever three things are present. First, shame, where people fear being ridiculed or diminished, where failure gets you a label rather than a lesson. Second, comparison, a constant, ambient ranking, where everyone is measured against a narrow ideal at all times. Third, disengagement, where people are afraid to take risks, afraid to try, afraid to be seen trying, because nobody feels safe enough to be a beginner. Put those three together in a family, a classroom, or a company, and you get a scarcity culture. And in a scarcity culture, vulnerability is genuinely dangerous. It is not paranoia to armor up in a place where being unarmored gets you hurt. So Brown is careful not to moralize about individual armor without naming the environments that make armor rational. Her formulation of the antidote is the part one find myself repeating to people. The opposite of scarcity is not abundance. Abundance is just scarcity with better inventory. It is still counting, still ranking, still measuring against a limit. The opposite of scarcity is enough. Sufficiency. The felt sense that what you have and here is not a deficit awaiting correction. That sense is what she calls wholeheartedness, engaging with the world from a place of worthiness rather than from a place of earning worthiness. Not I will be enough when. Just I am enough and I still want to grow. Those two statements are not in conflict, though scarcity culture insists they are. This is the distinction reviewers singled out, and rightly. Guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. That is a one-word difference and a total difference in consequence. Guilt is about behavior, and behavior is changeable, so guilt is uncomfortable in a way that is actually useful. It pushes you toward repair. You apologize, you fix it, you do it differently next time. Guilt holds something you did against something you value and shows you the gap. Shame does not do that. Shame collapses the gap between what you did and who you are, and once you are the problem, there is nothing to fix, there is only something to hide. Brown defines shame as the intensely painful belief that we are flawed and therefore unworthy of love and belonging. And that word therefore is doing enormous damage. It converts an imperfection into a disqualification. Her research finding on this is important and worth stating plainly. Shame is not a productive motivator. It is strongly correlated with the outcomes we would most like to avoid: addiction, depression, violence, aggression, bullying, eating disorders. There is essentially no good evidence that shame reliably makes people better. There is a great deal of evidence that it makes them defensive, secretive, and cruel, sometimes to themselves and sometimes outward. This is where the book stops being self-help and starts being useful in an argument. Enormous amounts of parenting, management, education, and public discourse run on shame as fuel, on the theory that if we make people feel small enough about who they are, they will improve. Brown's data says the opposite. Shame corrodes the very part of a person that believes change is possible. She also documents that shame is gendered in its content, even when it is universal in its mechanism. For women, the shame web is a tangle of contradictory demands: do it all, do it perfectly, and never appear to be trying. Appearance and body image come up again and again as the most frequent triggers, with motherhood close behind, an area where every choice seems to have a constituency prepared to condemn it. For men, the research points overwhelmingly at one thing: do not be perceived as weak. That is the whole map. And Brown recounts an encounter at a book signing that reframed her research: a man who told her, in effect, that his wife and daughters would rather watch him die on top of his white horse than see him fall off it. The people who love him most, he suggested, could not bear to see him afraid. That is the trap. If the only unacceptable state is weakness, then every honest expression of uncertainty becomes a threat to your standing as a man, which means the safest emotional register is a narrow band between silence and anger. What do you do about shame? Brown's answer is not to eliminate it. She says everyone who has the capacity for empathy and connection has the capacity for shame. The answer is what she calls shame resilience, and it has 4 moving parts. You recognize it and learn your triggers, because shame operates best in the dark and at speed. Naming it as it happens, noticing the flush, the tightening, the sudden urge to disappear or attack, takes a surprising amount of its power. You practice critical awareness, which means reality checking the expectation you just failed to meet. Is this standard even attainable? Who benefits from my believing it is? Most shame runs on an ideal that no actual human satisfies. You reach out. Shame tells you that you are the only one, and that story dies on contact with another person's honest response. This is where earned trust matters, because reaching out to the wrong person confirms the shame instead of dissolving it. And you speak shame, you say the thing out loud, in words, to someone who has earned it. Empathy is the antidote, and empathy cannot find you if you never say where you are. The heart of the book is its catalog of armor, the specific strategies we use to make ourselves less exposed. What makes this section land is that Brown does not describe armor as a character defect. She describes it as something that worked. Every piece of armor was, at some point, a reasonable adaptation to a real environment. The problem is that armor does not know when the war is over, and it is not selective about what it keeps out. She identifies 3 forms as the most common and most costly. The first is foreboding joy. This is the strangest and most recognizable one. You are standing in a moment of pure good, your child asleep, a person you love laughing in the next room, a stretch of life going well, and instead of feeling it, you brace. You rehearse the disaster. You imagine the phone call. Brown found that joy is the most difficult emotion for people to allow because it is the moment of maximum exposure. You are holding something you cannot bear to lose. And so we try to beat vulnerability to the punch by dress rehearsing tragedy on the unexamined theory that being pre-devastated softens the blow. It does not. It just means you were not there for the good part. Her research points to one reliable counter-practice, and it is not optimism. It is gratitude, specifically as a practice, not a feeling. The people who could stay inside joy were not the ones with less loss in their lives. Often they had more. They were the ones who had a habit of actively naming what they had while they still had it. The second form is perfectionism, and Brown draws a hard line between perfectionism and healthy striving. Healthy striving is self-focused. How can I improve this? Perfectionism is other-focused. What will they think? It is not about excellence at all. It is a belief that if you can perform and produce and look flawlessly enough, you can avoid the pain of judgment. She calls it a 20-ton shield we haul around, believing it protects us, when in fact it is the thing preventing us from being seen, and being seen is the only route to the connection we wanted in the first place. It is also, in practice, an efficient engine for never finishing anything. The third is numbing. Brown's finding here is the one I would put on a wall. We cannot selectively numb emotion. There is no mechanism by which you dull the anxiety, the grief, the vulnerability, and leave the joy intact. When you numb the dark, you numb the light in exactly the same measure. And then, feeling flat, you go looking for more of whatever will fill the flatness. The numbing agents are not exotic, alcohol and drugs, yes, but also busyness as a lifestyle, compulsive scrolling, food, work, shopping, staying so scheduled that no unmediated feeling can find a gap to enter through. Around those 3, she describes several smaller, sharper strategies that are worth naming because most of us use at least one habitually. There is what she calls Viking or victim, a worldview in which there are only 2 roles available, predator and prey, so any softness is surrender. There is floodlighting, where you disclose something enormous to someone who has not earned it, often unconsciously, in a way that overwhelms them and lets you conclude that openness does not work. There is the smash and grab, using shocking intimacy as a tool to short-circuit real connection. And there is serpentining, the exhausting art of zigzagging around a hard conversation you know you eventually have to have, pre-writing scripts, avoiding the room, managing everyone's feelings in advance, which typically costs more energy than the conversation would have. Setting armor down is not a single decision. Brown's version of the work is closer to noticing which piece you reach for, understanding what it once protected, and choosing, in specific moments and with specific people, to go without it. The second half of the book moves out of the individual and into culture, families, schools, organizations, and this is where it gets more practically demanding. Brown offers a diagnostic she calls minding the gap. Every group has aspirational values, the ones written on the website or spoken at the dinner table, and practiced values, the ones visible in what actually gets rewarded, tolerated, and punished. The gap between those 2 is where disengagement grows. And the size of the gap is not measured by what leaders say. It is measured by what the least powerful person in the room has learned to expect. You cannot close that gap with a value statement because the practice values are transmitted through behavior. A company that says it values risk-taking and then quietly sidelines the person whose project failed has taught everyone the real rule in a single move. A parent who preaches honesty and then punishes the child for an honest answer has done the same. Her name for the alternative in workplaces and classrooms is disruptive engagement. Disruptive because it interrupts the norm of self-protection, and engagement because the goal is participation, not comfort. She is specific about what a shame-based organization looks like, and the indicators are recognizable: perfectionism as a stated standard, favoritism, gossip, and backchanneling as the primary information system, name-calling, harassment. Blame is the first move after any failure. Blame is worth pausing on. Brown describes blame as a way of discharging discomfort and pain. It is fast, it feels like accountability, and it is almost the opposite, because the moment blame lands, the actual inquiry into what happened stops. The cost of all this is disengagement, which she identifies as the most damaging dynamic in families and organizations alike. Disengagement is not conflict. It is the absence of conflict. It is people who have stopped bothering, who no longer offer the idea, flag the problem, or ask the question, because they have calculated that the exposure is not worth it. And it is nearly invisible on any dashboard, because disengaged people are often perfectly compliant. They just are not there. Brown's most practical contribution in this section is her approach to feedback, framed as a set of readiness conditions rather than a technique. Am I ready to sit next to this person rather than across from them? Am I willing to put the problem in front of us both instead of between us? Can I listen, ask questions, and accept that I might not fully understand? Can I acknowledge what they do well instead of only where they fall short? Can I name my own contribution to the problem? Can I hold them accountable without shaming or blaming? Can I genuinely thank them for their effort rather than criticize them for their failings? Can I talk about how this will help them grow and model the same openness I am asking them to show? If you cannot answer those honestly, her advice is that you are not ready to give the feedback yet, which is uncomfortable and correct. The parenting chapter contains what I consider the book's most quietly devastating line of argument, and it applies well beyond parenting. Brown's finding is that who we are and how we engage with the world are far stronger predictors of how our children turn out than anything we know about parenting technique. Children do not primarily absorb our instructions. They absorb our relationship to failure, to uncertainty, to our own worth. They are watching how you talk about your body, how you handle being wrong, whether you apologize, whether you ever admit you are afraid. Which means the parenting question is not what should I teach them? It is, am I being the adult I want them to become? That is a much harder question, and it cannot be outsourced to a method. She reframes the goal, too. Most parenting anxiety is organized around producing a child who is successful and safe. Brown's version is a child who knows they are worthy of love and belonging, not because they perform well, but as a baseline that performance does not touch. The practical implication is that you separate the behavior from the being, every single time. You did something that hurt your sister is a sentence a child can act on. You are a bad brother is a sentence that becomes an identity. And she draws the distinction between fitting in and belonging, which I think is one of the more useful ideas in her entire body of work. Fitting in is assessing a situation and becoming whoever you need to be to gain acceptance. Belonging is being accepted as you already are. They feel similar from the inside, and they are opposites, because fitting in requires the abandonment of exactly the self that belonging would have welcomed. A child who learns to fit in at home, who learns that the price of the family's approval is not being themselves, will spend a very long time looking for belonging in places that only offer conditional membership. If I compress the book, here is what I would keep. Vulnerability has a definition, and it is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Once you hold that definition, you stop treating vulnerability as an occasional emotional event and start recognizing it as the constant condition of anything that matters to you. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is the most accurate measure of courage available, because courage without exposure is not courage, it is confidence. Shame and guilt are different, and the difference determines whether change is possible. I did something bad points toward repair. I am bad points toward hiding. Watch which one you use on yourself, and watch which one you use on the people who report to you or are alive with you. Shame does not work as a motivator. It correlates with the worst outcomes, not the best. Any system running on it, a family, a team, a public conversation, is buying compliance and paying in creativity, honesty, and trust. Shame resilience is a practice with parts. Recognize it, reality check the standard, reach out, and say it out loud to someone who has earned the right to hear it. Empathy is the solvent, but it can only reach what has been named. We live in a culture of never enough, built from shame, comparison, and disengagement. The answer is not abundance. It is enough. Armor is adaptive and expensive. Foreboding joy costs you the good moments while you are inside them. The counter-practice is deliberate gratitude. Perfectionism is about others' perception, not excellence, and it prevents the being seen that you actually wanted. Numbing is indiscriminate. You cannot dull the hard feelings and keep the bright ones. Boundaries are part of vulnerability, not a betrayal of it. Openness without discernment is not courage. Trust is built in marbles, in small accumulated moments, and you share your story with people who have earned it. Culture is what is practiced, not what is stated. Mind the gap between the two, and measure it by what the least powerful person expects to happen. Disengagement is the real cost. It is quiet, it looks like compliance, and it is what people choose when the exposure of participating stops feeling survivable. And who you are is more instructive than what you say. Children, teams, and partners learn from how you handle being wrong, being afraid, and being uncertain. I want to be honest about where I think this book asks more of you than it lets on. Daring greatly is written largely as an individual invitation, and vulnerability is not equally safe for everyone. In a scarcity culture, which the book itself defines with real clarity, some people can drop their armor and be met with grace, and others will be met with a performance review. Power shapes who gets to be uncertain out loud. The book acknowledges the environment, but places most of the responsibility on the person inside it, and I think the honest version is that the practice has to be calibrated with these people, in this room, at this level of exposure. Given what it will actually cost me. That is not a refutation. It is the boundary condition Brown herself points at when she insists that vulnerability without boundaries is not vulnerability at all. Daring greatly does not mean flinging yourself unarmored into every arena you happen to walk past. It means being deliberate about which arena is yours. Because the argument at the center of the book holds up. Everything you actually want, being loved for who you are, making something original, being trusted, changing your mind in public, repairing a relationship you damaged, lives on the far side of a moment you cannot control. There is no version of those things that comes with a guarantee attached. The armor works exactly as advertised. It keeps the humiliation out. It also keeps out the joy, the intimacy, and the creative risk, because those arrive through the same opening. Roosevelt's point at the Sorbonne was not that the person in the arena wins. He is quite specific that they may fail, and that they will certainly be covered in dust and sweat. His point was about where credit lies, not with the critic in the stands, who has risked nothing and is therefore always safe, and always right in the cheap way that costs nothing. So here is the question I would leave you with. Not what are you afraid of, which is easy to answer and easy to admire yourself for answering. Instead, what have you already decided not to attempt? What conversation, what project, what admission have you quietly filed under someday, in a way that means never? Where's the arena you keep walking past because the seats are more comfortable? You do not have to enter it today. But it is worth knowing that it is there, and that the reason you have not entered is not that you are unready. It is that entering will feel exactly like this, uncertain, risky, exposed, no matter how long you wait. That feeling is not the warning. It is the doorway.